In this video, we'll be covering everything there is to know about damage and armor sets, and how they both interact with each other. By the end of the video, you'll have a solid foundation of which weapons to use and which to avoid no matter the situation you're in. Let's dive right in. Damage in Bannerlord is quite a complex topic, but let's look at each factor that contributes to it. The weapon's base damage stat, weapon damage type, which body part is hit, the relative movement speed between the two combatants when the strike lands, where in the swing the strike lands, the weapon skill level of the attacker, and the perks from both combatants. A weapon's base damage stat dictates how much damage the weapon should do to an unarmored target if no other factors were involved, or at least logically that's what makes sense to me. However, I failed to find a single weapon where this held true. Oftentimes the actual damage was higher than the base damage, so don't use this number by itself, but use it in relative terms. If weapon A hits for 50 damage and weapon B hits for 60, then we know for sure weapon B does more damage, but it definitely will not be exactly 60. Understanding the different types of damage in Bannerlord is the main reason I made this guide, and we'll be spending most of our time here in just a minute, but let's cover the basics for now. There are 3 types of weapon damage: cut, pierce, and blunt. Cut damage will generally be the highest value of the 3, but is supposed to be reduced the most by armor. Pierce damage is supposed to bypass armor to some degree but have low damage values. And finally, blunt damage is supposed to have moderate damage but mostly ignore armor. The body part being hit has an effect on how much damage is done. Hits to the head give a bonus to damage ranging from 19% all the way up to 48%. It seems the lowest and highest damage weapons tend towards 19%, while the mid-tier weapons peak around 40%, resembling a bell curve, although this isn't 100% of the time. All hits to the body, abdomen, chest, shoulder, and arm receive no bonus damage, while hits to the leg do less than the average, anywhere from 9 to 22% less. The relative movement speed between two combatants also plays a role. If 2 people are moving towards each other, the damage is increased. If they're moving away, damage is decreased. Even a small relative speed difference can make a huge difference. This hatchet picks up 19% more damage with only 2.9 difference, while a very fast horse can add upwards of 600% more damage with the thrust attack.
No, that's a lot of damage!
Where the strike lands in the arc of the swing also plays a huge factor. Ideally, we want to land our strikes when the enemy is directly in front of us, as that produces the peak damage. Hitting at the very beginning or end of the swing can reduce damage to a tiny fraction of the max, essentially bouncing off. The same can be said for certain weapons like polearms, where hitting on the handle as opposed to the head of the weapon will do significantly less damage. And finally, a character's weapon skill and perk selection play a big factor in how much damage a strike will do. Higher skill will increase the damage done, which usually comes to roughly 10% for every 100 levels, or about 30% from level 0 to level 300. Now that we've got the basics covered, let's briefly go over how the testing was done. As with any experiment, it's important to hold all variables constant in a controlled environment, then apply changes to one variable at a time and take measurements. For these tests, I isolated Dirtbag Dirthert by himself and hired a companion to accompany me. The companion was equipped with a shield and no weapon, allowing for a perfect distraction to line up accurate and repeatable strikes. 1 hit was registered to each body category: head, body, arm, and leg. If there was any relative movement speed with the hit, the data was thrown out. If a good hit was registered, good defined by being at the very center of the swing, the result must be repeated at least 3 times before the data was considered good. This would eliminate variance from hitting at different parts of a swing and allowing for an accurate comparison across all of the data. Then I made a list of weapons, armor, and mounts to use and spent roughly 20 hours testing and collecting data. Only 264 individual tests were recorded, but over 1,000 tests were needed to get this accurate data set. Now let's look closer at the 3 different types of damage and see how they are affected by armor. Starting with cut damage and a low tier weapon, we see the armor values and the damage reduction values are almost identical. As we increase the armor values, the damage blocked values don't change that much, staying close to 100%. Actual damage versus weapon damage drops to as low as 8.5%, which is basically nothing. If we switch weapons to a higher damage two-handed sword, the damage reduction is much more pronounced, blocking upwards of 200% of the damage. The lowest our actual damage versus weapon damage is around 40%, which is still a significant amount. And finally, let's look at the highest base cut damage weapon in the game, the long glaive. The damage reduced by armor for most hits hovers around 225%, and only 35% of the stated weapon's damage getting through to do actual damage. With that said, over 60 damage is still getting through. Keep in mind, this is a level 0 combat character against the best armor in the game. In the interest of time, we won't cover every single scenario tested, but let's at least look at the long glaive with higher skill and perks. The damage at level 150 increases by about 17%, while damage absorbed by armor increases by 20%. Moving up to 300 without perks, we see another 12% increase to actual damage and 18% damage blocked by armor. If we add in all the perks, at level 300, actual damage shoots up by 25%, but the damage blocked by armor remains the same, around 265% of the armor's value. It's nice to see armor scaling with damage rather than a flat rate, but it's still not very effective against high damage, swingable weapons. Now let's check the same testing for thrust damage, starting with the crappy tapered blade. We see similar results with damage reduction versus armor value mostly staying around 100%, but actual damage versus weapon damage rating hovering around 75% for mid-tier armor and 40 to 50% for high-tier armor. Keep in mind, swing damage for the same test was around 8 to 12%, so a higher percentage of the damage number is getting through the armor. Looking at the two-handed sword now, we see damage reduction numbers staying around 100% and actual damage getting through between 40 to 60% for non-headshot hits. Cut damage was only getting 45% through, but the actual damage was still higher, around 60 damage per cut hit and only 30 to 40 for thrusts. And again, we'll finish comparing the long glaive thrust numbers. With no skill, very little damage is being blocked by late game armor, around 65% of the armor rating. Even worse, 15 to 30% of the actual damage rating is getting through the armor, resulting in sub 10 damage thrust hits. As we increase the skill and add perks into the mix, actual damage does increase some, but even with all the perks and 300 skill, our thrusts are barely hitting for 14 damage, or 35% of the weapon's damage rating. Even a hit to the head is barely doing 28. If we compare those to the swing cut of over 100 damage, it's not even close. The only reason to use thrust attacks in my eyes are physical limitations like a prison break where swing attacks may bounce off the walls and not land, but a thrust attack would. There is one caveat here. Thrust damage performed quite well with a large relative movement speed difference like mounted combat, getting upwards of 600% more damage. Time to test blunt damage. With no skill, we see mid-tier armor blocking around 90 to 100% of its armor value, but only 60 to 80% with the best armor in the game. It seems blunt damage is more effective the better the armor is, although sadly the actual damage done is low, since the starting base damage is low. If we add skill and perks, the damage reduced by armor increases, but actual damage versus the weapon's damage stat increases at a faster pace, going from 45% with no skill up to around 80% with 300 skill and perks. To sum up the melee weapon damage section, all damage types are blocked by armor to a large degree. Blunt damage has the highest percentage of damage passing through armor, but not by that much. If we look at the actual damage being done, high damage cut weapons like two-handed swords and polearms have such a high base damage amount that even reducing it by 50% or more isn't enough to keep from being one shot. Blunt weapons still perform well with high skill and perks, so don't discount them. But if you have two-handed or polearm skill and want to do the most damage per hit, then go that route instead. As far as thrust attacks, avoid using them at all costs unless you're on horseback at high speeds or you're in a confined area where thrust attacks are the only ones that will land. These are the only scenarios in which thrust attacks are acceptable. Now let's look at ranged weapon testing, starting with bow and arrow. I was quite shocked to see how damage is calculated for different arrow damage ratings. We see the same test repeated with 0 through 4 pierce arrows, and with each setup, only 1 to 2 damage increase can be seen. This holds true for the hunting and recurve bow, level 0 bow all the way up to level 300. I guess I was expecting more performance from the pierce arrows that cost significantly more than other arrow types, but it seems the type of bow and the skill of the main character are the biggest factors. Moving up to the noble bow, we see the same pattern with arrow damage increasing by 1 to 2 for each step up we go. As we get further away from our target, the damage drops off sharply, reducing by 23% at 50 meters and 43% at 100 meters with no armor. If we add armor into the mix, there's a massive drop in damage. At point blank range, we only do 35 damage versus the 175 against unarmored. At 100 meters, we're only doing 25% of that damage amount, or 9 in total. It seems armor is very effective against ranged attacks. Switching to the noble longbow, we see very similar results, although the noble longbow does hit harder. Against armor, it adds around 10 damage at close range and about half of that at 100 meters. I know crossbows aren't that popular to use, but I tested the bound crossbow anyway so we can compare. Sadly, we see the same pattern of high tier bolts doing very little to increase damage done. Against armor or at distance, the damage done is almost identical for the best and the worst bolts. Interestingly enough, crossbows perform worse against unarmored targets compared to bows. They also do about half the damage against armor at close range, but at 100 meters the damage is nearly identical. One unfortunate aspect of using crossbows is that higher skill does not increase damage output. What? Only reload speed and accuracy. What the f? Now let's see how damage scales for javelins, starting with the worst ones in the game. The damage only falls off 8% at 50 meters, which is about the longest distance you can reliably hit a single target. Against armor, however, damage drops to 6. If we boost our skill up to 300 and take the perks, damage skyrockets to over 200. Even against armor, it's still hitting for 75 damage. Switching over to the best javelins in the game, we see the same 8% drop off at 50 meters without armor. Against armor with no skill, damage is reduced by a significant amount, with only 20 to 25% getting through. However, once we pump up the skill and perks, there's no chance of survival, even from the maximum distance. It's interesting to see how little damage drops off for javelins and how effective armor is at preventing damage. But once you get a high enough throwing skill, even the worst javelins can be deadly. For the final section, I wanted to test charge damage for mounted combat. We'll be testing 4 mounts in total, starting with the worst in the game and 100 riding skill. At maximum speed against an unarmored target, we do 5 damage. Against full armor, we do less than half that amount, only 2. The next 2 horses have the same charge damage value, but the Storm Chaser is faster than the Batanian Hobby. The slower horse only does 4 damage, while the faster does 6. I'm glad to see relative speed making a big difference in damage even with the same charge damage value. Testing the Royal Destrier, we see damage against armor increase to 10. However, we see the biggest change when we up the skill to 300 and add in perks. The damage increase is exponential, going from 4 to 42 for the Batanian Hobby, 6 to 44 for the Storm Chaser, and 10 to 53 for the Royal Destrier. Against an unarmored target, we see a staggering 78 damage done, which is nearly a one-shot. I also tested to see if wearing a heavy loadout and heavy horse armor made a difference, but the damage at top speed was the same for both. The key to charge damage is in the skill more than in the horse, so be sure to get the 275 riding perk if you want to do significant charge damage. A few things really stood out to me with this testing. I really thought blunt damage would perform better. I didn't realize thrust damage was nearly useless, and that high tier arrows barely have any benefit over the low tier ones. Let me know in the comments what surprised you the most. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you on the next one.